Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 99, February 6th to February 12th, 1863. Last week, we actually had a fairly eventful episode. First, we had the blockade at Charleston being temporarily broken by Confederate rams. The South would hope that this action would potentially lead to foreign aid in the form of supplies, but they were sadly mistaken, the blockade resuming business as usual shortly thereafter. We had the Battle of Dover, which saw Nathan Bedford Forrest swear never to serve under Joe Wheeler ever again. Finally, we had the establishing of the 1st South Carolina Regiment, the first regiment made of black troops. This week, we have a lighter episode. We will head briefly to Vicksburg, but we are also going to take a look at some world events from 1862, much in the same way we did back in 1861. Before we really get into that, though, I do want to mention that very shortly there should be a new Patreon episode. It's going to be a memoir review, and this is going to be Rufus Dawes of the Iron Brigade, and figure now is about as good a time as any to roll out Dawes, sort of the halfway in some of these major events that the Iron Brigade is involved in. You know, we already had Antietam, 2nd Manassas, and we're coming up on Gettysburg as well. So if that sounds like something that interests you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. And of course, those proceeds go toward the general upkeep of the show. It goes without saying that it is also greatly appreciated. This week, we need to talk about the USS Indianola, which passes Vicksburg, but overall, we need to talk about the war on the Mississippi River, which has shifted. I want to mention that David Dixon Porter will be taking the reins. Charles Davis received a promotion to Rear Admiral as a result of the success seen on the Mississippi thus far. For the South, without the CSS Arkansas, the Confederacy is down severely in terms of vessels that can challenge the Union war effort. A shift in emphasis from boats to torpedoes will be the name of the game, most notably announced by the sinking of the USS Cairo. The USS Cairo, if you recall, was already looking for torpedoes, one having exploded near the naval column previously. That was shortly before it met its demise. Torpedoes or mines were a major morale boost to the South because it allowed for a Confederate response and settling the score slightly when compared with a large amount of warships the North was going to be able to rain down on the Confederacy. Remember that the mines are set up using an electric cable that would be detonated from the shore. Rebel agents could either use the banks of the river or floating logs, such as we saw on the Yazoo River. One can imagine that sitting on the bank and detonating an explosive was probably not a desirable job, especially considering a miss would result in angry shelling by the Northern Navy. Men needed to be paid with a bounty system to handle the coal torpedo, which was a cast iron explosive covered in coal dust. This is interesting and would be deployed just as you would imagine, by being put into regular coal. Once in a boiler, the explosive would detonate, which was a costly occurrence. If this happened, it would be difficult for the Union Navy to realize that there had been foul play, or rather, foul coal as it were. Remember too that Gabriel Rains is the head of the Torpedo Bureau, which is actually part of the Confederate Secret Service. Torpedoes did result in the damaging of 40 Union ships during the war, which shows to their effectiveness. This still led to moral questions. Remember that landmines were not yet considered to be honorable in terms of warfare. Because of this, there were special considerations when it came to their use. There was actually a plan that was concocted by Confederate agents to float torpedoes at targets on the Great Lakes, which was declined by Jefferson Davis. The reason for this was that despite there being potential industrial targets on the lakes, the impact to civilians and the collateral damage that would be accrued. Just a quick aside, I think this is another example of the lack of there being a total war, even with things looking bleak for the Confederacy. They still would not turn to actions that could inflict heavy civilian loss and casualties. We saw already in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862 that there were qualms about using landmines even for military purposes, for military targets, on the very narrow roadways that led up the peninsula towards Richmond. There had been some landmines planted, and we mentioned Gabriel Rains before in that regard. There's also going to be several other instances during the war of landmines and just the general negative response from both sides, including, of course, the Union, which is mostly going to be the recipient of these landmines, but also Confederates who comment on how that's not how they want to wage the war. So it is sort of interesting to see there. By the winter of 1863, the strategic situation was that the Confederate-held areas on the Mississippi had severely shrunk. With the recent Battle of Arkansas Post, which effectively closed off the Arkansas River, there was really one major river left that fed into the Mississippi, that being the Red River. Now, the Red River was important because it led out to Texas. Supplies could travel along the Red River, move down to Vicksburg, and then be transported by rail to the rest of the Confederacy. You remember, we talked about in a recent episode Galveston being back into rebel hands, and that's important. Why? Because there's a railroad that goes into Galveston, and you could make your way eventually to Vicksburg. So if you have blockade runners that are making it to Texas, likewise, if you had Texan goods, that's one of the arguments that the governor of Texas has for shoring up Galveston, making sure that the state is secure because they're sending key supplies east. So that's another reason why Vicksburg is important, because it does connect the west and the eastern portion of the Confederacy. Because of the supply situation, it would be a high priority by Porter and the Navy to shut off the river to rebel traffic. Charles Ellet would be given the task of blockading the Red River. His ram, the Queen of the West, would sail past Vicksburg on February 2, 1863, making it under the guns, although a support vessel did not. Something else we need to talk about, too, is that, at least it strikes me, and maybe you have a different opinion if you do some research about it, but for as formidable as the guns at Vicksburg seem to be, they don't really perform particularly well. The Queen of the West is able to get by. We're going to see in the Vicksburg campaign, a key moment is Grant sending ships and transports to pass Vicksburg. So it is kind of one of those things where there's always this talk about how it could be detrimental to the U.S. Navy, and there could be plunging fire, and certainly there's a little bit of that we see, but never really this big destruction of their vessels. And you see a lot of these situations where they end up getting by. So just kind of interesting to point out. The presence of the Queen of the West was felt very quickly. Ellet would capture 3 Confederate transports running supplies from the Red River to Port Hudson, which we need to talk about as well. On February 14th, they would capture another Confederate transport, which would inform Ellet that there were other transports up the Red River. The Queen of the West would move up the river, but would fall into a trap. A Confederate battery would open up on the ram. In the process, she would run aground, taking hits from the Confederate 32-pounders. Ellet would leave his wounded and abandoned ship, moving back to the captured transport. Enter the USS Indianola. The Indianola was a side-wheel ironclad produced in Cincinnati, Ohio. Production of the vessel actually had to be stopped in 1862 with the Confederate invasion of Kentucky. She was armed with 4 guns and 3-inch thick iron plating, and in February of 1863 was also towing 2 coal barges meant for the resupply of the Queen of the West. Finding the survivors of that vessel now displaced, the Indianola set up to be the blockading force at the mouth of the Red River. It was considered that with the armor, the ironclad might fare better against the guns that had struck the ram and forced her to run aground. Whether the Indianola was going to be a match for the fort or not was not going to be found out, though. Confederate forces were able to scramble together in order to face this threat. Lieutenant Colonel Lovell, brother of Mansfield Lovell, detached from assignment on the staff of John Pemberton, would be the commander of the responding rebels. He would capture and man the Queen of the West, repairing the vessel, as well as a converted ram, the Webb. In a weird twist of fate, the Queen of the West had destroyed the Confederate riverboat, the Colonel Lovell, named for the capturing officer. This has actually happened. Previously, I believe we mentioned during the battle around Memphis, this happens. Along with 2 more ships, the hunt was on for the Indianola. It was decided to move north on the Mississippi and connect back with Porter and his fleet. Unfortunately for the ironclad, the Queen of the West and the Webb were both faster vessels, catching up to the Indianola before she could make it to safety. The Queen of the West would ram a coal barge attached to the Union ship, still tied for that very purpose. The success would be short-lived, as the Webb would find its target. Originally thought that the damage would still allow for capture, it was apparent to the Union commander that the ironclad was sinking. Putting close to shore, the ship was abandoned, and the Federal crew taken prisoner. It would be possible for the rebels to salvage the Indianola, though, and work would be underway to try to raise the vessel. Obviously, adding an ironclad would be a nice addition to the lacking river defense fleet. Porter would not want this to happen, but he would also have no ships to spare, as he was occupied with the beginnings of Grant's new operations against Vicksburg. A dummy vessel would be rigged to look like an ironclad and floated downriver. Confederate salvage efforts would cease, the Indianola fired to prevent her from falling back into the hands of the U.S. Navy. There would be an attempt to raise the guns of the Indianola later by the South, but for now, the ironclad would be out of their hands. I would like to mention briefly Port Hudson, Louisiana, which would play a part as our story unfolds, the other formidable Confederate work on the Mississippi, which could be paired with Vicksburg to bookend the rebel-held territory on the river. Port Hudson is a position with strong bluffs a little north of Baton Rouge. Crucially for our episode today, it was very close to the mouth of the Red River as it feeds into the Mississippi. While it was an important position, amazingly the fortifications would not be constructed until later, suggested by P.G.T. Beauregard in 1862. The bluff was 80 feet above the river, earthworks constructed to fire down on potential enemy ships. The terrain was difficult from the landward approach, which would dissuade any Union infantry attempts on Port Hudson for a time. Several lunettes would be constructed on the riverside. The USS Essex had tried to test the Port Hudson defenses in 1862, but found that it was in fact a strong position. Hit 14 times, 2 of the guns burst. Porter would report probably 35 to 40 guns on the enemy works on the bluff. A railroad would be constructed at the behest of Jefferson Davis so that Vicksburg and Port Hudson would be able to provide support for one another. Due to this connection, Port Hudson would be an objective of the Union Army during the ultimate campaign for Vicksburg, as we will see moving forward. Putting pressure on both places would very much be on the to-do list for General Grant. While tying down the potential reinforcements for one or the other was important, it was also reasoned that if one of these positions fell, it would not be long that the other one would hold out. And we're going to see that actually in July here coming up, that being the case. Well, this is just a quick mention this week. I think it's important because we haven't mentioned Port Hudson until now, at least not quite so much in depth, and it is going to be a big part of our story here coming up as we get into the summer. So we can take a short look at some world events not happening in the Civil War. I think it's always interesting to see what exactly is going on as the North and South battle it out in America. We did a very similar rundown for 1861, so now we have recently turned the page to 1863, and I think it's fair to give the same treatment for last year, 1862. Selfishly, I picked mostly political or military events because, well, I think you should know why by this point, but I tried to diversify the portfolio just a tad to mention some other things. One big event that I'm actually going to cover next week has some direct consequences on our story, which I'm going to actually skip for now. That event is actually the French intervention into Mexico, which is going to play into the potential strained foreign relations with Napoleon III and the French government. I want to give that Central American event a little more press, and we'll go in more depth next week. It's actually probably interesting too. I think, we all know Cinco de Mayo, right? Some of us have a good time on Cinco de Mayo, and exactly why we celebrate that holiday and its connection to the French intervention is interesting and probably not something that everybody knows, and exactly how the story unfolds after, right? Because it is a victory, but it's a short-lived victory, as we're going to see. So these events are always eye-opening because it's not something that we would normally learn, right? First, let's stay in America for some astrological news. Alvin Graham Clark would be the first to identify a white dwarf star in 1862. He would use a telescope in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, to spot Sirius B. Now, a white dwarf star is something that happens after a large star has gone through its red giant phase, as I've come to find out. Sirius B is actually one of the largest ever discovered, twice as large of a mass as other white dwarfs. This mass is packed to a volume equal to that of Earth's. The surface temperature is over 25,000 Kelvin, but its temperature will slowly decline over the next 2 billion years as it radiates into space. Potentially, it may have burned quite a bit more brightly now than our sun, at least when it was in that same stage. Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, had already been discovered, but it was thought that this star had a companion, which was spotted by Clark in 1862. Clark used a telescope with an 18.5-inch lens, which is still at Northwestern University to this day. So there you go, some star news for you today. And I would imagine that's probably not something that you were expecting. But when it comes to the Civil War Weekly podcast, you should always expect the unexpected, so there you go. We have two events from England we need to mention. The first is a coal mine disaster. This is known as the Hartley Colliery disaster in Northumberland, England. 204 men and children died as a result. The beam from the mine's pumping engine broke and fell down a shaft, trapping the miners below. This pump was used to remove seawater from the Hester mine. An extensive but slow rescue attempt unfolded. Unfortunately, carbon monoxide being released would draw these attempts to a halt. Efforts would then be placed into the recovery of the bodies. A newspaper captured the morbid scene. All the blinds were drawn, but looking in at the open doors, we saw coffins in every house. In most instances, they lay upon the large bed, so characteristic of the pitman's dwelling. Sometimes the bed would not contain all the coffins, and then they were disposed on chairs beside it. And so we passed up the row and saw 2 and 3 and 4 coffins all in one little room, till at last, coming to the end house, we were appalled to see a perfect pile of them. In looking around, we were informed that 7 dead bodies lay in the cottage. In every house, women were sitting by the fire, nursing their grief, and strong men, pale and dejected, were visibly suffering from the reaction of the excitement of the past week. The youngest of the victims was actually 10 years old, and the oldest was 71. One family lost 9 in the disaster. As a result, it was mandated that mines have 2 means of escape in England. This 2-shaft policy was passed in Parliament in August of 1862. Additionally, there would be more support for the families of miners. It's always interesting when you hear about these disasters and how in these mining towns, and it's the same in the United States too, that a lot of the individuals find work in the mine or a factory, especially if it's in a more remote location. So if there is a disaster like this, it's pretty tragic because it affects the entire populace, the entire town, right? So it is always difficult to read about these things, and at least there was some positive that came out of it in terms of some pretty immediate response in making things at least a little safer. It's obviously mining, especially back in the 1800s, probably wouldn't be the occupation that I would choose in terms of finding something safe. But at least there were some positives that came out of it. On a general, more positive note, the Westminster Bridge, or the Second Bridge, was finished and opened in 1862. This would be one of the iconic bridges over the Thames in London, designed by Thomas Page. It is 820 feet long and 85 feet wide. This is, as of 1967, the oldest structure crossing the Thames in central London. In South Africa, there was a civil war in the Transvaal between Boer political factions. While not go too much in depth, the British had recognized the independence of the Boers in this area. But there will be conflict, including the Zulu Wars, which will bring them closer into the fold, eventually sparking the Boer Wars in the 1880s, which will be a real guerrilla conflict, and in some ways, a precursor to the British military experience prior to World War I. I think maybe I might do a little bit of, at least when the American Civil War is over, I might talk a little bit about some conflicts that occur after the conclusion and maybe try to take away some things from those wars. The Zulu Wars, the Boer Wars, they're on my short list for that, so I kind of want to maybe make it an extra episode at a certain point later, and we can draw some conclusions and see exactly how they're going to connect with the Civil War, and if there were, if any, lessons learned. Just as there are individuals, including, say, George B. McClellan, who go and observe the Crimean War prior to the Civil War, and they learn from that. So certainly there are foreign observers during the American Civil War as well. You know, the Confederacy, of course, is more than happy to let, French and British observers show up, and, maybe they'll be able to sway their government into providing them some material support, and maybe even bring about a close to the war. So we'll talk about that hopefully in a future episode. Otto von Bismarck would give his famous Blood and Iron speech in September of 1862. Prussia and Germany is going to be in the process of unification, which is really solidified in the 1870s. Bismarck is going to be a big part of that. At the conclusion of his speech, he would say, "The position of Prussia in Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Prussia must concentrate its strength and hold it for the favorable moment which has already come and gone several times. Since the treaties of Vienna, our frontiers have been ill-designed for a healthy body politic. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood." Bismarck would become known as the Iron Chancellor, which was partially because of the speech and partially because of his overall foreign policy, which was, shall we say, aggressive. In 1862, we had the Treaty of Saigon, which would establish a French foothold in Indochina, modern-day Vietnam. The reason why I want to end with this particular event is because, as I've mentioned before, Napoleon III is interested in reestablishing a real French empire. This would involve acquiring possessions in Asia, Africa, and even the Americas. The Americas would be too close to home for the federal government, but while a civil war is going on, this would seem like a good time to get involved from a French perspective. This French venture in Vietnam is going to, of course, come to a head with the First Indochina War, which lasted from 1946 to 1954. The seeds of this and the expansion start here in 1862. So let's go ahead and bring this episode to a close. We had more action on the Mississippi River. Hopefully we have a better idea of what's going on in terms of the type of war that is being fought in that location. I think also we have a better idea of the strategic situation. We have a good idea of world events as they stood in 1862, and now that we've turned the page to 1863. So those are just some things to keep in mind as we move forward. Next week, we have a couple of events, but I also want to get into the already mentioned French intervention into Mexico. During the episode next week, we are going to give a brief rundown, but we're going to start in the beginning, and we're going to go all the way even past the timeline of events for our story so that we can get to the end. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon and Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Once again, feedback is welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.